Welcome back to the Werewolf Howling of the Midnight Channel. For those of you who are just arriving and listening to our channel for the first time, prepare to enter a world where darkness hides horrors that most prefer to pretend don't exist. And for those of you who are already subscribed and follow our Nights of Terror, you know that the true stories we bring here are not for the faint of heart. Get comfortable wherever you are. Look closely at the dark corners of your room and pay attention. Today, we have one of those terrifying stories that will stick in your mind. A brutal account of encounters with werewolves that defies all logic. My Uncle David wasn't a man to show weakness. He had the kind of presence that filled an entire room with calloused hands from a lifetime of working in lumber mills and a face weathered by the sun and the merciless cold of West Virginia. But there was one detail about him that everyone in the family knew, accepted, and that absolutely no one talked about. His house was never dark. Never. I grew up visiting his property outside Charleston, and I remember perfectly how the house seemed like a beacon in the darkness of the countryside. The porch light, the living room lamps, the hallway lamp, and the bright bedroom light. Everything was on from sunset until the next morning. As a child, I thought it was just an eccentricity of a single man. My mother said he didn't like tripping over furniture, and that was the excuse we swallowed for years. The truth, however, was much darker and rooted in absolute terror. He wasn't afraid of tripping. He had a paralyzing dread of what might lurk in the shadows, waiting for the exact moment the light faded. His energy bill must have been astronomical, but for him, it was the price of his own sanity. The price of trying to keep away the memory of something he saw that destroyed his mind forever. To understand the weight of what happened, you need to understand who my uncle was before that fall of 1998. He was part of a group of 4 inseparable friends. They were experienced hunters, men who knew the Appalachian forests like the back of their hands. They weren't amateurs who shot at anything that moved. They were trackers, survivalists who spent weeks in the wilderness carrying only the essentials. Every November, they had a tradition. They loaded their gear into pickup trucks and drove to an extremely remote area of the Monongahela National Forest. It wasn't a tourist camp. It was rugged, densely wooded terrain, located more than 50 miles from any paved highway or sign of civilization. It was their territory, or at least that's what they believed. They knew every hill, every stream, and every deer trail in that region. The false sense of security was absolute. They felt at the top of the food chain, armed with high-precision rifles and decades of combined experience. But nature has ancient rules, and there are things that roam those mountains that respect neither gunpowder nor human arrogance. Things that consider humans merely as slow and vulnerable intruders. When I became an adult, I began to piece together this macabre puzzle. My uncle's permanent paranoia wasn't limited to just the lights. There was a pattern in his behavior that revealed a deep and constant dread. He installed heavy locks on all the doors and windows in a way that seemed excessive for a quiet town. But what disturbed me most were his eyes. If you talked to Uncle David at night, you noticed that his eyes never stayed fixed on you. They were always scanning the room, watching the windows, checking the gaps in the curtains, looking for any unusual movement. It was the look of prey that knows the predator is still nearby. Once, during a Thanksgiving dinner, the lights flickered because of a storm, and the house was in darkness for a mere 10 seconds. His reaction was inhuman. He didn't scream, but the sound of his breathing became rough, raspy, and he cowered against the wall, gripping a carving knife so tightly that his knuckles turned white. When the light returned, he was covered in cold sweat and locked himself in his room for the rest of the night. It was then that I understood that the physical horror had ended in the forest, but the psychological horror continued to devour him alive every day. He was a prisoner of his own memory. I managed to extract parts of his story many years later, not through long conversations, but in small fragments spoken in moments of weakness, added to the police reports from that time that I myself sought out to investigate. That autumn was exceptionally cold. The four men parked their trucks on the side of a dirt road and began the 15-mile hike into the wilderness. The plan was to establish base camp in a clearing they had used for almost 10 years. My uncle carried the main tent and heavy supplies, while the other three, Bill, Tommy, and a fellow named Hank, divided the ammunition and trail equipment. The air was heavy, with that dense humidity typical of the mountains that makes the cold penetrate straight to the bones. The hike took hours, traversing uneven terrain and climbing elevations exceeding 3,000 feet. The environment was spectacular, with centuries-old trees blocking much of the sunlight even during the day. But according to the few words my uncle told me, there was something fundamentally wrong with the forest from the moment they crossed the tree line. A somber atmosphere, an inexplicable weight that made the back of their necks tingle. Normally, the forest is a noisy place. There are birds, insects, the wind rustling through the dry leaves, and the constant sound of small animals moving through the bushes. But upon reaching the clearing to set up camp, the group noticed a disturbing anomaly. A deathly silence. There was absolutely no sound, no birdsong, no insect buzzing. The forest seemed to have held its breath. For experienced hunters, the total absence of wildlife is the first and most serious warning sign that an alpha predator, something at the top of the food chain, has taken control of that territory and cleared the area. Smaller animals simply abandon the place or hide completely to avoid being hunted. The group tried to rationalize. They told themselves it was just a change in atmospheric pressure or the proximity of an early snowstorm, but the rational discomfort soon began to turn into unease. The smell in the air was also off. A coppery, ancient odor, reminiscent of damp earth mixed with rotten meat, lingered near the tree line. They pitched their tents, lit a large bonfire, and tried to laugh and drink as they did every year, instinctively ignoring the fact that the shadows around the campsite seemed denser than usual. They didn't know it, but something gigantic and lethal was already watching them, calculating the weight and speed of each one of them. The nightmare was only beginning. The first morning in the Monongahela Forest brought a biting cold, with temperatures nearing 20 degrees Fahrenheit and a thick fog creeping low across the damp ground. My uncle and his friends woke early, driven by decades of hunting routine. The plan was to cover a radius of about 5 miles from camp, searching for fresh tracks or feeding areas of the deer. It was during this first sweep that their rationality suffered its first severe blow. About 2 miles north of base camp, they found the remains of old traps they used to mark territory. They weren't small traps, but heavy galvanized steel gears, forged to withstand the impact of bears or large animals. What my uncle saw left him paralyzed. One of these traps, anchored to the base of a massive oak tree, was completely destroyed. But the problem wasn't the state of destruction, but rather the mechanics of the damage. The chains hadn't broken from tension, and the metal hadn't rusted. The steel was bent and twisted inside out, as if something had stepped on it, felt the metal close around its leg, and with a movement of brute force and impatience, simply tore the structure apart with its hands or claws, crushing the iron as if it were aluminum foil. No black bear in West Virginia has opposable thumbs or the muscular leverage to crush reinforced steel in this way. My uncle looked at the other men. No one said a word, but the silence between them weighed tons. The rational discomfort, the attempt to blame rival hunters or faulty equipment, died right there. Something with impossible strength roamed those mountains. After discovering the trap, the hike became methodical and fraught with suffocating tension. They split into pairs, always maintaining visual contact at a distance of 100 feet from each other, with their rifles unlocked. What they were looking for, however, simply no longer existed. For hours of walking along steep ridges and deep valleys, searching every inch of earth and fine snow, they realized the impossible. There were no tracks. The disappearance of the fauna was not only auditory, it was physical. There were no deer tracks, no recent droppings, no tree bark rubbed by antlers. It was as if an invisible line had been drawn in the middle of the forest, and every creature with a self-preservation instinct had fled that perimeter. For hunters who know the pattern of animal migration and behavior, finding an area of several square kilometers completely sterilized of life is terrifying. It means that the predator was not just passing through, it had claimed that space. My uncle recalled that, at that moment, the feeling of being in control evaporated. They walked, looking over their shoulders, stopping every few minutes to check the perimeter. The forest, with its trees exceeding 60 feet in height, seemed to have closed in around them, transforming the old hunting trails into a dark and claustrophobic labyrinth. The environment itself began to drain the group's courage, replacing the adrenaline of the hunt with the primal and overwhelming instinct for survival. As late afternoon approached, the sun began to disappear behind the mountain range much earlier than expected, casting long, distorted shadows across the camp. The temperature plummeted, but the cold wasn't the biggest problem. It was the darkness. My uncle's account of that particular night shaped his behavior for the rest of his life. He told me that the darkness in that forest wasn't just the absence of light. It felt physical, heavy, like an entity pressing down on the camp's boundaries. They lit the campfire as high as they could, piling heavy logs, trying to create a shield of heat and light against the dense darkness. Paranoia set in quickly. The group ate dinner in almost complete silence. The few words exchanged were harsh whispers about keeping watch during the early morning hours. The false sense of security they had felt the previous morning had crumbled. They were no longer hunters waiting for prey. They were castaways in a dark ocean, sitting around a very fragile island of light. My uncle took the first watch. He scanned the line of trees incessantly, gripping the rifle so tightly his arms ached. The darkness outside the ring of light from the campfire seemed to move, the shadows dancing in a way that defied logic. He felt that coppery, rotten smell invading his nostrils in sporadic puffs carried by the cold wind, confirming that the threat was near, just waiting for the right opportunity, waiting for their patience to run out or the fire to die down. The night was past its midpoint when the impossible transformed into a real and tangible tragedy. The camp was in absolute silence, except for the crackling of the embers. The watch shift had changed, and my uncle lay in his tent, immersed in a shallow and restless sleep, his loaded gun beside him. The awakening didn't come from a shout or gunshots, but from an urgent whisper by Bill, the unofficial leader of the group, outside the tent. His tone was trembling and devoid of any authority. When my uncle stepped out, feeling the freezing air hit his face, he saw Bill pointing at Tommy's tent with a flickering flashlight. Was the tent torn? No. Had there been a struggle? No. The entrance to Tommy's tent was perfectly unzipped, the zipper pulled down almost surgically. The sleeping bag inside was open. Tommy had disappeared. But the detail that drove a sting of ice into my uncle's chest and made his stomach churn with pure terror was the footwear. Tommy's heavy winter boots, the ones that took him 15 minutes to lace and unlace every morning, and that were absolutely essential for walking on that terrain, were perfectly lined up outside the tent, untouched. It was as if Tommy had gotten up in the middle of the extreme cold in his socks and simply walked silently into the darkness, without a weapon, without protection, without making a sound whatsoever, to alert the other men less than 10 feet away. The terror that seized them was crippling. Rationality died definitively there. Despair gripped the 3 remaining men. Equipped with high-powered flashlights and rifles at the ready, they began searching the immediate area, covering an initial radius of 50 feet. The ground was covered by a thin layer of morning frost. They found Tommy's footprints, shallow marks of socks sinking into the cold, hardened soil. The footprints ran in a straight line, away from the camp and into the denser part of the forest. They followed the trail, their hearts pounding, the beams of light cutting through the darkness like fragile swords. But about 100 feet from the camp, Tommy's footprints simply stopped. They didn't change direction. They showed no signs of running, skidding, or struggling. They simply ended in the middle of nowhere, as if he had been lifted from the ground by something impossibly strong and silent, or as if he had evaporated into the frigid West Virginia night. No ordinary predator attacks like that. No known beast in North America snatches a grown man from the ground without causing a crackling of branches, without leaving a trail of blood, without dragging its prey. The realization of what this meant overwhelmed the 3 men. They were dealing with an alpha hunter operating on rules beyond known nature. A pure predator, intelligent enough to open a tent, quick enough to act in total silence, and strong enough to carry nearly 200 pounds of dead weight through the air. My uncle looked up at the treetops hidden in the darkness, and paranoia solidified in his soul. The danger was no longer just in the shadows. It was in every direction beyond what the eye could see. The dawn light brought no relief to the 3 men remaining in the forest. On the contrary, the sunlight only exposed the vastness of the isolation in which they were sunk. My Uncle David, Bill, and Hank spent the next 12 hours scouring every inch of that section of the forest, covering an area of almost 3 square miles around the point where Tommy's footprints had disappeared. They walked in circles, checked deep ravines, searched the bases of ancient trees and dry riverbeds. Nothing. No torn clothing, no fallen equipment, no sign of a struggle. The forest had swallowed a grown man weighing almost 200 pounds whole without chewing or leaving crumbs. The panic, which had been a spark before, had turned into an uncontrollable fire within their minds. The logical and desperate decision was to abandon all heavy equipment. They left the tents pitched, dropped the extra supplies, and kept only the water, flashlights, ammunition, and rifles. The goal was to hike the 15 miles back to the trucks before the sun set again, but the mountains seemed to close in on them. What had once been a familiar, well-mapped trail suddenly transformed into an unrecognizable labyrinth. Compasses seemed disoriented, pointing in inconsistent directions, and the topography seemed to conspire to hinder their progress. Climbs that should have been gentle required colossal effort, and the rugged terrain punished every step. And all the while, the sickly silence of the forest continued, serving as a constant reminder that the owner of that territory was merely waiting for the advantage of darkness to return. They were being herded back into the middle of nowhere. They couldn't reach the road. When the sun began to bleed from behind the mountain peaks, casting those long, distorted shadows my uncle would fear for the rest of his life, they were still at least 7 miles from the trucks. The temperature dropped drastically again, but cold sweat soaked their clothes. Continuing to walk in the absolute darkness of the dense forest was suicide, but stopping also seemed like a death sentence. They decided to keep going, moving shoulder to shoulder, the beams of their flashlights cutting through the thin blizzard that was beginning to fall. That's when the auditory terror began. It wasn't theatrical howls or movie animal grunts. What my uncle heard, and what haunted him for decades, was the sound of breathing. It was heavy, rhythmic, air being pulled in and pushed out by lungs that seemed too large to belong to anything natural. The breathing came from the darkness, sometimes 100 feet away, sometimes seeming to be less than 20 feet, circling the group. The coppery, rotten smell returned, so strong that Hank vomited in the middle of the trail, unable to bear the nausea induced by sheer terror. The creature wasn't just hunting, it was toying with them. It was wearing down the men's nerves, draining their sanity before striking. My uncle gripped the rifle so tightly that the tendons in his arms felt like they were about to tear, pointing the weapon at every moving shadow. But the predator was too fast. It operated in the blind spots, using the geometry of the forest to its advantage, a crushing pressure in the dark environment. The moment the denial finally broke was swift, but it etched a definitive and destructive image into my uncle's mind. They had stopped for a second near a cluster of limestone rocks so Bill could change the batteries in his flashlight, which was beginning to fail. My uncle was covering the rear, sweeping the darkness with his own beam of light. The beam swept across the trunk of a massive oak tree about 40 feet away and stopped. There it was. The light illuminated only fragments, but it was enough for the human brain to understand that it was facing an abomination. The silhouette was immense, easily exceeding 7 feet in height, standing on its hind legs in a way a wolf never could, but with an arched posture no human possessed. The shoulders were too broad, the dark fur seemed to absorb the flashlight's light instead of reflecting it. But what paralyzed my uncle, what prevented him from pulling the trigger, were the eyes. The predator did not avert its face from the light. It looked directly at my uncle. There was a cruel, ancient intelligence in that reflective gaze, a precise understanding of the terror he was causing. He wasn't a hungry animal. He was a hunter aware of his absolute superiority. The exchange of glances lasted less than 3 seconds. The dark form didn't attack. It simply retreated into the shadows with a fluid, impactless movement, disappearing into the darkness without breaking a single dry branch. My uncle tried to warn the others, tried to articulate what he had seen, but the words wouldn't come out. His throat tightened in a knot of pure physical horror. The sight of the creature annihilated what little tactical discipline remained among the 3 men. Primal fear took over completely, and they began to quicken their pace, almost running across treacherous terrain full of exposed roots, which was the worst possible decision. Hank was visibly crumbling, silently crying, stumbling, and muttering meaningless prayers as he trembled behind the trio. My uncle was in the middle, and Bill led the desperate march. They had entered a narrow ravine with walls of earth and roots rising about 10 feet on each side. The attack happened precisely in the area where their mobility was least. My uncle felt the brutal shift in air before he saw anything. A gust of foul, icy wind swept over him from the top of the ravine. He turned in time to see the beam of light from Hank's flashlight point wildly at the dark sky for a fraction of a second, and then the flashlight fell to the ground, illuminating the dry leaves. Hank was simply no longer there. There was no time for him to scream. There was no sound of a body being dragged or clothes being torn. The predator swooped down from the top of the ravine, seized a grown man in mid-motion, and returned to the darkness above the slope in a single, lethal, continuous, muffled movement. My uncle and Bill pointed their rifles upward, firing blindly at the treetops, emptying their weapons into the dark in a hysterical panic, but the bullets only hit wood and empty space. They were alone with the monster, and it would take them one by one. The escape that followed had no rationality left. Bill and my uncle ran blindly through the night forest, bumping into logs, scraping their faces on low branches, driven only by a massive surge of adrenaline. The creature's breath now seemed to be everywhere, echoing through the trees, keeping pace with their frantic rhythm. It was on a steep slope, less than 2 miles from where the truck should have been, that the final tragedy was sealed, scarring my uncle's soul forever. The ground gave way beneath Bill's feet. He slipped and rolled violently down the slope, slamming his back against a rock formation at the bottom of the ravine. My uncle slid right behind him, stopping a few feet away. Bill tried to get up, but his right leg couldn't support his weight, and he collapsed again. The darkness around them seemed to contract, and the beast's scent filled the air so strongly that the oxygen seemed to have run out. My uncle told me that at that exact moment, Bill didn't shout for help and didn't try to crawl. He simply looked at my uncle in the darkness, illuminated only by the remaining battery of the flashlight that had fallen to the ground. He raised his rifle towards the tree line, where the shadows seemed to gain volume and mass. My uncle never knew the absolute truth, and that was the anchor of his torment. Did Bill stay behind on purpose to give him a chance to run, assuming the position of sacrifice? Or had he simply given up because of the fracture, paralyzed by shock and fear? And my uncle cowardly took advantage of that distraction to save his own skin. He didn't help his friend. He didn't try to carry him. My uncle turned his back on the man he had hunted with for decades and ran, climbing the opposite slope on his hands and feet, while he felt the temperature drop and death take over the space behind him. I don't know how my uncle survived that final run, and I believe he didn't know either. He ran for miles through the dense woods, driven by a terror so primal and absolute that his body operated far beyond its physical limits. He tore his clothes, cut his face and hands on dry branches, stumbled over hidden roots, but he never stopped, and above all, never looked back. The most disturbing detail of that desperate escape wasn't the exhaustion, but the sound he didn't hear. As he climbed the slope and moved away from Bill, there were no gunshots. There were no cries of agony. There was no sound of a struggle. There was only the sound of the cold West Virginia wind whipping through the trees and the heavy, unnatural silence of the forest swallowing yet another grown man. It was only when the first faint rays of a pale sun began to cut through the morning mist that he finally collapsed to his knees at the edge of the dirt road, about 2 miles from where the trucks were parked. The asphalt and gravel had never felt so safe, but his mind was already irrevocably fractured. He was dirty, bleeding, his muscles trembling uncontrollably from incipient hypothermia and shock. He crawled to the vehicle, started the engine with numb hands, and drove back to civilization. Physically, he had escaped the creature's grasp. Psychologically, he would never leave that dark forest. The predator didn't need to kill him to devour his life. The social horror that followed my uncle's return was, in a way, as suffocating as the physical horror of the mountain. When he arrived at the county sheriff's office to report the disappearance of Tommy, Hank, and Bill, he encountered a barrier of systemic apathy that big city people simply cannot comprehend. In rural and isolated regions, there is a silent pact about what lives in the mountains and what should not be discussed aloud. The sheriff listened to my uncle's trembling and chaotic account. He recorded the panic, recorded the state of the torn clothes and the haunted look, but at no point did he organize a search commensurate with the tragedy. The bureaucratic paperwork was filled with generic terms. They were registered as missing in a tragic hunting accident, possibly victims of an early snowstorm or an aggressive bear. The sheriff didn't ask difficult questions. He didn't question the fact that 3 veteran hunters who had known those trails for decades had disappeared without leaving a single physical trace behind. No one wanted to go to that clearing in the Monongahela Forest to investigate the tents torn from the inside out or the crushed massive steel traps. The whole town seemed to know on a subconscious and terrifying level that some stones shouldn't be turned over. Their silence wasn't an armed conspiracy, it was a defense mechanism. The cowardly and desperate way that people from the countryside have of dealing with threats that the police can't arrest and that guns can't kill. Weeks turned into months, and months stretched into decades, crystallizing the grim routine that defined the rest of my Uncle David's life. He never set foot in a forest again. The man who once spent weeks camping in the middle of nowhere became terrified of any tree that cast a shadow on his yard. He transformed his own house into an illuminated fortress. The behavior my family always treated as a harmless quirk was, in fact, a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder caused by a non-human force. He installed high-voltage lamps in every room, in the hallway, on the porch, and even in the basement. The light switch became the only weapon he trusted. I spent holidays watching him sit in the living room armchair, the lights hurting his eyes, refusing to sleep until the sun actually rose. He knew that monsters don't disappear when you close your eyes. They just get closer. The werewolf, or whatever that abomination was that walked on 2 legs with sadistic intelligence, no longer needed to actively hunt him. The mere memory of its gigantic silhouette and cruel eyes in the darkness was enough to keep my uncle in a constant state of vigilance. He died many years later in his own bed, surrounded by an ocean of electric light. The medical report said his heart failed. I know his heart simply couldn't take beating any longer in a constant state of terror. The worst aspect of surviving a monstrous ordeal isn't the fear of the creature returning, but the weight of guilt that rots the survivor's soul. My uncle carried an unbearable burden until his last breath. The doubt about what really happened in that narrow ravine. During the few times he mentioned the night of the hunt, his gaze would wander into the void, reliving that millisecond of decision. Bill slipped and fell, his leg broke, and then came Bill's choice to raise his rifle to the shadows instead of calling for help. My uncle fled. The ambiguity of this sacrifice was the true poison that destroyed Uncle David from the inside. Did Bill, knowing the beast would catch them at any moment, decide to give his best friend a window of time to run? Or was Bill in shock, paralyzed by terror, and my uncle, driven by the animal instinct for self-preservation, saw his friends fall not as a tragedy, but as a cruel opportunity to escape? That was the question that kept him awake at night. He traded a friend's life for his own and returned to a city that demanded he pretend nothing impossible had happened. This is psychological terror in its purest form. The beast took his friends into the forest, but left the guilt to slowly gnaw at him for the rest of his life. Today, I live in the same house that once belonged to him. I inherited the property, the heavy furniture, and the silence of that isolated place. But above all, I inherited the paranoia. I've spent my whole life hearing scary stories like distant fairy tales, urban legends made to frighten children before bed. However, after piecing together every fragment of what happened on that hunting trip, after seeing what absolute terror did to a strong man, the stories ceased to be fiction. These true accounts are scars that humanity tries to cover with skepticism. When the sun sets and night swallows Charleston, I find myself staring at the line of trees at the end of the property. I pay attention to the absence of sounds. I feel the weight of the darkness. And then, without even thinking, I get up and turn on the porch light, then the living room light, then the hallway light. I can no longer stay in the dark because now I understand what my uncle always knew. Light doesn't ward off monsters. It only allows you to see when they're coming for you. Terror isn't just what lurks in the night, it's what the night does to you forever. If you've made it to the end of this story and felt the presence of the unknown drawing near, don't ignore that instinct. The darkness hides more secrets than humanity is ready to bear, and encounters with werewolves or creatures beyond our comprehension are happening right now, in places where daylight doesn't reach. If this kind of real, unfiltered terror makes your blood run cold, don't forget to subscribe to the Werewolf Howling of the Midnight channel, like this video, and share it with someone who also can't sleep with the lights off. Leave a comment about what you would do if you were in that forest, and remember, never trust the silence of the night. Until next time, and keep your eyes open.